Hello, everybody, and welcome this afternoon to our Open Access Week 2024 panel. I'm very delighted to have all of you joining us. My name's Dr. Danny Kingsley. I am the Director of Library Services, and I have responsibility here in the library for the information area, and that includes scholarly communication. And I'm going to be the facilitator today for the session. We're going to enjoy a panel discussion focused on the question of community over commercialisation. And that's the theme of this year's International Open Access Week, which is being celebrated around the world. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the country on which we meet. I'm here on the land of the Wadawurrung people of the Kulin Nation on our Geelong campus. Deakin is located on the land of the Wurundjeri people in Burwood, and the Warrnambool campus is located on the lands of the Peak Wurrung people of the Maar Nation. And we'll have visitors joining us from all over the country on the lands of peoples across this country. And I express my gratitude for their care of country, which continues to sustain us as it's done for millennia. And education has a long and rich heritage on this continent, and we aim to honour and reflect that in the ways we teach and learn at Deakin University. So while we're showing gratitude, I'd just like to personally thank the amazing Open Access Week Planning Committee for pulling together such an amazing series of events this week. And today, in addition, thanks particularly to Lauren Halkin-Smith and Caitlin Savage for managing the technical aspects of the event, and Angela Gleeson for pulling the Mentimeter together. So let's turn to our womanal of a panel. So we've just noted that all of the people we have on our panel today are women. So it's a womanal instead of a manal. So first of all, we have Jeanette Fife, who's our Pro Vice Chancellor of Research Development, the Research and Development Academy. And in relation to this discussion, she's interested in the development of academic judgment, and she's actively studying the idea of the university. She is also contributing for the university in terms of the OA Task Force Steering Committee, so has great involvement in this area. Sally MacArthur is the Director of the Institute for Frontier Materials and brings a publishing perspective because she's part of a society that relies heavily on publishing as a source of income. Sally's worked in industry research, and she tries to work out how to make the research that's done digestible for people outside academia. She also assists us by being on the OA Task Force Steering Committee. Catherine Aston-Morney is Associate Professor in Human Biology, and she undertakes research into diabetes. She's working with sessions on for HDR students, but not just at Deakin, but more broadly, to understand how we can mobilise this group and change the culture towards a more open environment. And Karlis Wazatsky is Senior Lecturer in Education and Maths Education, and she works with teachers writing curriculum and courses. She has a great deal of community outreach, such as writing industry reports, infographics, and is on advisory panels and writes for The Conversation. So we're really delighted to have such a fantastic group of people who have both one foot in the academic environment and one foot in the sort of translation into the community environment to be able to talk to us today. But first of all, we want to hear from you, our audience. So what we'd like you to do is to take out your phones and scan the QR code that's on your screen. The screen I'm seeing is not the screen you're seeing, so I'm assuming that that's all okay for everybody. You can see the QR code and go to the URL there. And what we might do is, Lauren, if you could put in menti.com and the code into the chat, that would help people who didn't have enough time to get their QR codes sorted, and they can just go to their internet. So what we'd like to know of the people participating today is your involvement in academic publishing. So if you are doing all four of these, then please answer all four. If you're just contributing to one, we didn't do a none. I've realised it probably would have been an idea, but I'm assuming that most of the people on this call have had some involvement with publishing in some capacity. So Lauren's put up the link now into the chat. And you will notice while we're just looking for this, waiting for these results to come through, we have both the chat and the Q&A enabled today. So if you do have questions that you would like to ask of the panel, please post those questions into the Q&A rather than the chat. It will just make it slightly easier for us to manage. So early on, we had a race that peer review was winning. And now we've got more people involved in publishing work. Now, you're all very naughty. If you're publishing, you should be peer reviewing twice as much as you publish, given that we're expecting 2 peer reviews of each paper. Okay, perfect. Great. That's good. That gives us an indication about the engagement we have. Could we move on, please, to the next question? If you undertake peer review, how many papers approximately do you peer review a year? I personally had to go back and have a look myself and count up because I feel like I'm forever peer reviewing. And it turned out that this year I've peer reviewed 9 papers. So that's not all the time, but it's pretty consistent. So we've got at the moment 3/4 of the respondents are reviewing between 1 and 5 papers, and then 1/4 between 11 and 15 papers. The amount we review is often quite dependent on the discipline. The effort involved in a peer review of different disciplines is can be quite different. Let's move on to the next question. So this is a question about your engagement with open access. What are the things that you might have done in terms of open access? Have you deposited work in a repository or published something under one of our read and publish agreements that's a negotiated, or a read and publish agreement in your own institution if you're not a Deakin person? Published in a Diamond open access journal, which is an open and free to read, but also free to publish journal, or edited for one of those journals, or shared an article from one of those journals. It's very positive to see people engaging with the repository. Makes my heart sing. Somebody who's had a long involvement with the repositories. Okay, and last question for this session, or this section, is it's just an open response. What do you think needs to happen to progress open access in Australia? That's an easy question to answer. We can solve that. Down with rankings. Fair enough. I agree. I'm not supposed to bring my own opinion to this, I think. I think I'm supposed to stay editorially neutral. Okay, interesting responses here. And these responses may speak, some of the things that the panel talked to may speak to some of these issues that are coming up here. Interesting. Okay, so what we've got is on the screen through several responses that respond to measurement and assessment, and stranglehold of the big publishers and publishing conglomerates. Great. Okay, that's fantastic. Excellent work. Thank you. Thank you for your feedback there. And I think that really helps us understand where people are who are attending, and that can help us with the conversation. So let's go into the discussion. So, dear panel, and what we're going to be doing is asking a couple of questions as provocations, and then let the conversation flow. And it won't be one question for people answering. We'll let the conversation flow. The panel will interrupt one another or put up their hand if they're feeling particularly polite. But I'd suggest staying off mute and just jumping in if you want to. So the first provocation. So when we talk about community over commercialisation, the community we're talking about is predominantly academia itself. So when we have a situation where open access and the broader implications about open access are not necessarily well understood across the academic space, that can cause issues. Have you seen evidence of that issue of academia not necessarily understanding open access and the implications? And if you have, what do you think we need to do to progress? Jeanette, do you want to start? You're in the role of trying to teach people about such things.
Thanks, Danny. Sally looked like she was about to jump in there, but look, I think one of the things that I've seen, and I hear about it in various workshops and environments where I'm with people who are new to publishing, is just general confusion about all of the options in terms of open access. So like, what's the difference between green and gold and diamond, and what's this mean, and do I have to pay this, and what is this for real? And just there's a confusion to something that should actually be an exciting milestone in someone's life. Hi, I've got my first article ready for publication. I'm trying to engage in this process that is new and bewildering. And there's just another factor that you need to think about that is, it's unclear, it's hard to know where to get the right information if you don't know that the library is your friend in all of these things, that, you know, the place to go for really straight, clear, accurate information about open access and your options for publishing is your friendly librarian. And also the more experienced colleagues in your area, that you can seek advice, that no one is born knowing the difference between all the different types of open access. So to me, one of the implications is the muddying of the waters in a moment that should really be about getting your research out in the world, and ends up being a whole question of even your personal politics and your career trajectory. So there's so many factors come in to something that is already a fairly difficult decision.
Other thoughts?
I'd say probably most of these factors are also completely different to the factors that a lot of the prestige and your track record and everything is judged on. So the culture that we as researchers grew up in, and what we did for publishing and what was the best to do for publishing is very, very different when it comes to the open access era. And so many of the senior people that people are looking up to when they're publishing their first paper do not have a good idea of what open access is either. So the examples that are being set are not helping this either.
You seem in furious agreement there, Sally.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the dearth of misinformation, the dearth of assumptions, the really bad players that we have in the scene that have dragged down the actual environment for us as well, where we've got predatory publications, where and people have then used that as the reason that it's an open access problem, and it's nothing to do with open access. It's poorly executed commercial interests that have actually gone down this path. And I think the other side of it being, the first question being around money, and we can't afford it. And it's like, hang on, let's just take a couple of steps back. And I think there's a general lack of understanding of what publishing is in our broader academic community. It's really interesting when you talk to people how little they understand how an impact factor is generated, why you might want to focus on citations ahead of the actual journal impact factor, things like that. There's a level of education gap, I think, around publishing, full stop, that makes it difficult for open access to get clear air. And also, particularly if we're thinking about data portfolios and things like that. All the other aspects of open access get muddled into this publishing piece as well.
Carly, what's your observation?
So I try and enact a bit of a philosophy of publishing that's very much about the communities that I'm researching for, and how I want my ideas to impact and be taken up within those communities. And I'm a really staunch critic of commercialisation in education, because I think, you know, that's a force that is kind of limiting us to scholarly tactics that I think are now out of date in terms of those metrics and measures of what makes a successful public intellectual.
It's almost, we love a metric, but we use them in all the wrong ways, and they're lazy, actually, I think. And so much, I love that, Carly, around, do you understand what you're trying to achieve here and what your values are, and that your publishing should reflect your values beyond just getting stuff out there. And I think we do that through HDRs. We breed this until it becomes embedded in our system as well. Unless we break it, nothing's going to change.
Think about the timelines here. Jeanette has described the confusing terminology, and this is a bit of a lot of a bugbear of mine, about how the terms have shifted over time. They didn't start off being good terms in the first place, and then they got even more confusing, and now we've got a cornucopia of colours, and what even does all this mean? But particularly as we've started pushing closer and more towards payment for publishing being the understood mechanism for open access, which of course is only one of multiple mechanisms to make something open access. I'm wondering if there's a correlation between the point that somebody comes into the equation and the level of confusion or the kinds of assumptions they're making about open access is a factor. You know, we've all kind of been around for a little while and been in the game for a bit, so that we're sort of seeing this shift over time. But for somebody stepping in for the first time, they're just seeing what's in front of them. I don't know if there's any observations on that.
For me, I think there's a timing issue. So particularly if you're an early career researcher, you're trying to establish a pipeline, the idea of paying to publish quickly is probably attractive. But of course, as we know, early career researchers don't necessarily have the access to resources to do that. Once you've got a pipeline established and a track record established, I guess you've learned more about yourself as a scholar, and you've developed your writing skills. And that, of course, gives you more choice in terms of the outlets that you're choosing. And I guess the confidence to publish more broadly into media outlets, which is something that I try to do as well, so that I'm disseminating to the broadest possible audience.
Yeah, I think, Jeanette, you had thoughts on that?
I was just going to say, sort of possibly picking it up in a slightly different angle. I think, you know, when you're first confronted with this idea, you think, what am I paying? What is this money for? Like, what's the service I'm being provided here for the payment of this money? And you start thinking about it, but like peer review is just being done by the people down the hall who are not being paid for it. It's digital. Like, what are these processing costs? Are they real? Is this serious? What's going on? And I actually think that it's baffling, because it actually makes no logical sense. Like, it really, if you really think about it, this arrangement that we have around academic publishing is not logical. It's completely irrational. It's an exploitation model, and it's commercialisation. Who is winning? Not academia, right? And so I think when you're new to publishing and you confront this, you're being inducted into a thing that sort of doesn't make sense. It undermines the whole endeavour. I think it just sort of lurks at the back of our mind like a dirty secret that we're all putting up with something that's absolute nonsense, but feel powerless to intervene on. And I think there's, I don't know, potentially for very idealistic youngsters, a moment of going, what have my forebears been doing?
A bit like climate change, really, but let's not go there.
I know, but you know, like it is. we may be at a tipping point, hopefully.
I
So
think
something, Kat and Sally, you've observed that sort of like, what is this about? I don't understand what the
well, I
money.
think publishing has always been an absolute scam, right? You know, it's a business, and the publishers have done incredibly well with it. And the idea of open access is a wonderful idea, and the you know, what open access is actually meant to bring to the community versus what publishers have mutated open access into with article processing charges so that they can monetize open access, because open access is a bit of a threat to their model. We have, and I absolutely agree with Jeanette that people are looking at these things, and the fees for a single publisher can vary from, you know, they can vary 20-fold across the different journals they manage. They're not doing anything different. They're just saying, if you want to publish in Nature Tab, we can charge you $15,000, right? Because you want to publish with us. Whereas in the lower impact journals, they're charging less. So those fees are absolutely not for any actual work. It's just how much we're willing to pay for the perceived prestige of those journals.
I think there's another level here as well, which is actually about how we talk about publications too. There's a lot of build-up in that you must publish. Not that you've got something that is ready to be published, but that there are time points that you must publish, otherwise you're not succeeding. And so I think it's really interesting to think about, how do we reset some of this thinking as well, around quantity, quality, and intent. You know, why is it that you're publishing this? Why is this the piece of information versus I've got to tick a box at the end of my first year to have my first publication in draft, you know, or else I'm not succeeding. And having worked with lots of people where projects vary so significantly, some projects you can churn out, you know, people are priding themselves on 10 papers out of a PhD, and I'm like, wow, how, why? And that, you sort of have to ask yourself, is that handle turning? Or is that just that that project is now at a point that 6 other PhDs came before it? And so I think, again, our conversations with our colleagues around the purpose of publication, the conversations about also the questions we ask them about how much time they're spending reviewing and being part of the community, and, you know, the people who are talking about getting rubbish papers but not really declining them. And again, it just becomes a cultural piece now that we're actually joining the mill, rather than actually going, actually, let's just stop that for a second and step off.
We're perpetuating it too, because
Yeah,
it's how we're judging people. You know, we look at our performance metrics across the year, and the only way to get research time in the following year is to publish a certain number of articles this year. And so we're actually just making it worse and worse, because we're still expecting those metrics, and that's how we're judging researchers. So we need to change that mindset, which involves working with the people who are making these decisions.
Can I jump in there? I just want to pick up on something Sally said. So, like, you know, we're talking about publications and publishing. I like talking about scholarly communication, because it's, publishing is not the thing, it's the communication. So it has to land somewhere. You've got to have an audience in mind. And when I think about where to publish, I think, well, what conversation do I want to be joining? If you think of each journal as a dinner party that you want to be invited to, where is the one that is talking about the thing that I have something to say about? What contribution can I make to that conversation that is already being held by that community, those editors, the peer reviewers, the other authors who have published there, and the readers of that journal? If you think about it like that, that's sort of what the decisions should be about. What is my contribution? Not what can I get away with? Can I just scrape over the threshold? Am I contributing something to a conversation that forwards the discipline? Like, I am a Pollyanna. I think idealistically about all of these things and try not to get too muddied with this stuff about prestige. But if you think about it like that, it allows you to say, well, do I want to go and join the dinner party with those aloof, status-hungry, nightmare people? Maybe no one wants to go to those parties anymore. You know, can't we start thinking about it like that? Like, if we really put our values on our sleeve, a lot of us are in universities. I mean, we could be in many other places. We're in universities probably driven by values around contribution, around change for the better, around a better world, about tackling really wicked problems like diversity and inclusion and, you know, really major things, we should be able to garner that in these moments of where do I want to communicate with whom, and what conversation am I joining? And so to me, like if we can have more of this kind of debate and open it up rather than just following the scripts that have been established, you know, and they are based on the olden days when someone needed to typeset things and there was paper involved and postage and all of that. You were paying for that. But in the age of digital, it's not like that anymore. And, you know, like the preprint archives, they're just go there, man. Anyway, sorry.
That idea of scholarly communication, I think, speaks to the work that you do, Carly, in terms of sort of working with the practitioner, so beyond the academic, you know, ivory tower, and writing for the conversation and so on. How do you see that intersection between that kind of communication versus the paper, which is ostensibly supposed to be a communication piece?
So I made a decision early in my career that I wanted to be talking with policymakers, and I wanted my thinking to be influencing the conditions for teachers to do their work and for students to learn about mathematics, but about finance and other real world things as well. And being really true to that goal has helped how I've made publishing decisions. Inevitably, my research has to be good and it has to be regarded as good, which means that I have to choose the right outlets for publishing it. But also, I'm realistic that some of the people in my audience, like those policymakers, will prefer to read an 800-word piece that lands in their inbox via a blog on a Monday morning compared with a Q1 journal article. Now, they want to know that the Q1 journal article is in the background, but it means moving in and out of different genres of communicating, depending on who you want to be talking to. And more recently, any Q1s that I've published in have made the articles available open access as well, which I think is fabulous.
That is an interesting point in terms of ensuring that if your material or the work does get written about, say, in the conversation, or you're writing about yourself in the conversation, that you're linking to the original work that is openly available, either because it was published open access or in a repository. I'm thinking back into the conversation a little bit earlier about the students who are suddenly, or young researchers who are suddenly faced with a bill. And so what are we paying for? And this is an interesting time because for a long time, libraries have been screaming about the fact that publishers have been, you know, charging huge amounts of money, but we've kind of kept that the market of the buyer and the user, the seller, it's separate from one another. So the academics reading the material are the kind of customers, and the publishers selling it are the kind of, you know, the salespeople, but we were sort of like the intermediary, and that was invisible. And so suddenly now it's become to the fore, and those questions are starting to be asked. How much of a difference do you think that makes to the conversation?
I'd say that, yeah, so many early career researchers, mid-career researchers, late career researchers, they don't have the money to be paying for the publications. And so it's not so much what is this paying for, but how do I pay this? And so it really can be a financial decision to whether you can pay it or not. A lot of money that you might have for research you're not allowed to use for publications, or you just simply don't have enough at the time the publication comes around.
Who's seen as the bad person in that, though?
Who then is the bad? Yeah, that's the publishers.
Yeah, I think it depends who raised you. I think it sort of depends on the community or who your mentors are, where you're getting advice. Because I think, yeah, it has been, researchers have been shielded, and it's becoming more transparent actually what's going on. And so to me, it just increases the cognitive dissonance of, so you pay to get it in, and then we're also paying to get it out. What is going on here? Like, it should be a one-way payment at least. It shouldn't be, you know, the money should be a completely different thing, but you certainly shouldn't pay to put it in and to get it out. And we're paying both sides of that equation. That's now more visible, I think, with the advocacy of libraries. Like, I think every library in the country is having conversations like this with their research community, you know, this week. Wonderful. And it's making it more visible. It's making these kind of secret threads that have been traveling through the decisions that we make as researchers about where to publish more visible, more transparent, and open for discussion. And I really do think it depends. So sometimes the person giving the message will be copping some flack about it. You're trying to change us. Don't you understand we're making decisions based on other things that aren't about reducing the financial burden on the institution. Like, I think the way the message is crafted about what the need for change is needs to be multi-level, because there are really serious financial implications for institutions around this. There's implications for individual researchers and research groups, etc. But there's also the values piece. There's like morality, if you want to go there. So and your politics involved in this as well. So all of those factors come in, and we have such a diverse researcher community. We need to be able to make the argument in lots of different ways and draw on the different logics that are prevailing.
I think if the fees are so difficult for many of us, and even when we provide mechanisms to help support researchers to be able to pay those fees, it really, the access for other places that do not have the funds at all, like, it's still a privileged environment where, now that we've gone to article processing charges, only those with money get the option to publish. Whereas previously, when it was pay to access but not pay to publish, at least in, more, lower income countries, and it was still accessible for publication. But yeah.
I think it's also, when you've got a culture that's embedded in loving I'm better than you are because I publish in this journal, it doesn't matter who you are. If you've got an opportunity to get a paper in Nature, you know that that's going to carry just huge. If you have to pay £15,000 to go open access in Nature, the chances of you being able to afford it are zip. But also, it means your leading research is getting shoved behind a paywall as well. So it starts to become this damned if you do, damned if you don't situation ethically, because who's going to sacrifice? I can't publish for Nature. No, nobody's going to do that. That's just a step way further than anybody is going to be willing to do. And so once we start to get into these conversations, I don't think most people understand the underpinning of the commercialisation of publications and the difference between the organisations who do publish as well. So it wasn't until I was editing for one of the journals that is run by a society that I started to see how it played in, and how, for my ethics, that was actually, I was quite supportive of that type of approach, because I could see the other things we would achieve. But at the same time, we still fall into that same trap of what are we trying to do? Even with that best intention behind us, it's a lot of donated work. It's a lot of not recognising the contributions, even with the best will in the world, the contributions that people make. And the next level becomes the peer review gets weaker and weaker and weaker, because nobody wants to spend the time doing it. So the quality of what we accept gets weaker. And then the next layer is that the data streams and the questioning, the reproducibility gets weaker and weaker and weaker. And there was an article, I think this week, around, 1 in 7 papers is probably reproducible. And you're like, this is what we rely on. This is the record of science. This is the record, as a STEM person, of what people have done. And if it's that weak, we've got this mismatch again between, if you're pushing to publish, the risk that you're going to publish something that isn't, you're allowed to publish stuff that isn't right at the time with the best will in the world. We all make mistakes, or we learn afterwards. But deliberately publishing or obfuscating is driving a lot of this culture as well. If a student has got to push to publish in their first year, how do we do that?
Well, I'm sort of wondering, because we are teetering on the issue of assessment, and I think we want to try and stay focused on the question about open access and community over commercialisation in that space. But we know the elephant in the room is the assessment system, which is pushing a lot of this behaviour. Given, and we saw that in some of the answers, there is sort of like OA has become shorthand for pay to publish. And we know that that is not necessarily the case. There are lots of other alternatives. Given that that is now the shorthand, what implications does that have? How can we overcome that challenge?
I think the problem becomes that there's the path of least resistance. That's the easy solution. That's why it's being put out there. It's not actually tackling the underlying problem, which is show me the really good system where for my field, it works open access as proper open access. Where are examples? Where are our shining lights on the hill that are actually really making this work well? Not just the pre-publishing sort of stuff, but actually what are the ones in the area? So should we be getting behind just creating 1 or 2 beacons and driving them to work in different fields, and maybe picking the areas that in health, you know, Kat works in diabetes, should we be really pushing to have chronic disease journals that we need doctors to read about and things like that, and educational journals, that being the ones that we're like, as a society, we appreciate these things, we value this. And so actually then we're having such big conversations with the nation as educators at the moment around the value of education. How does this actually manifest into, we're not a closed shop, we're open? Beyond the shores of Australia though too, because I think that's the other side of this. If all we're doing is it's our research for our people, that's not research.
It's interesting what you said there, Sally, because a lot of the prestige and value of the journals that are now, you know, not great for us, it comes from them being those sort of society journals, right? The preeminent diabetes journal in America was for the American Diabetes Association, run by them, and for your membership, you got the journal sent to you and all that sort of thing. And that's where the value comes from. It's all been moved, but we're still applying that value there. So I guess it means that if we can shift it back the other way, there is value coming from those scientific bodies, those peak organisations for that disease or whatever, actually putting their weight behind a good quality journal as well. I also see with the pay to publish kind of thing, and I've seen some clear examples where it's really working against moving forward in open access, where we have high-level people who control the money, and people will request funds for publishing in open access, and they will just outright say no because they view it as pay to publish and poor quality. So they're actually preventing people within their organisations from being able to access the open access. And again, that's education around, you know, it's not just the junior researchers that need this education, it's the high-level researchers that perhaps need even more education because of the different way that the publishing system has worked throughout their careers. And I guess a lot of them, when open access was this wonderful idea, and then it's kind of hasn't really progressed the way it was, and a whole lot of different obstacles have come up, and so they're kind of a little bit disengaged with it because they've seen it hasn't really happened the way that we hoped it would. So I think we've got a lot of challenges there, but as Sally was saying, there's the opportunities if we can sort of get, you know, if we can get enough people behind these ideas and the support behind it to say, we will value you publishing in these kind of formats, we actually do have the power to make some movement.
So Carly and Kat, you're both, you're both environments where the practitioners are perhaps not in the academic space. So the users of the work, even regardless of whether they're reading it in its published format or in its interpreted format in the blog or whatever, are not likely to cite it because that's not why they're reading it. And so if we're valuing citation, that's contrary to the actual audience of the work. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I write in an emerging field, which is financial literacy and financial education. And by nature of that field, my citation scores are low. And I also write for teacher practitioner journals, which don't count in the formal sense of the word. And so when I'm, applying for promotion, for example, I create a narrative around impact and reach to the profession that sits outside of the formal metrics.
And I think you're taking that conscious effort to recognise and identify and come up with an approach that is acceptable, for want of a better term. And I think this comes back to the same for people who work with industry partners, who, have constraints on what they can publish, but also they get blocked. Rather than trying to find a solution, they use this as the excuse. And so I don't think we enable people to form exactly what you've done, Carly. It's so exciting to see somebody actually create the narrative around their publication or lack of, or we don't measure impact. And really, this is what publications are about, an impact outside of academia. That's, if I did the engagement and impact exercises for the ARC for both cycles, and we just don't get impact. We don't understand how to actually use what we know in that context. And I think, again, what would happen if we had an industry-led journal or a sector-led journal, rather than, in the same way that Kat's talking about a diabetes association, we have manufacturing journals, yet we don't put that much detailed research into them. We miss an opportunity to communicate the value of research in other audiences as well, which again makes it very easy for governments to cut universities. So maybe we're sort of got a whole jumble of things going on here that would work really well for open access.
Okay, so we're starting to talk about solutions or alternatives, which is great, which is where we want to sort of start moving towards in this conversation. So the idea of the engagement and impact is an interesting one because that happened in the REF as well in the UK. And I was working at Cambridge for the second REF. And the first REF, Cambridge did really poorly in the impact because it said, we've published a lot in Nature and we're Cambridge. And they said, we don't care. And that was a real comeuppance of, oh, okay, we misunderstood what impact is. So that's an interesting, because we talk about research impact, but we actually don't mean societal impact. We mean bibliometric impact, which is a problem. So let's think about other solutions. So we're starting to talk about, re-engaging with our academic community in terms of sort of societies of X, and also trying to think about how we could engage with industry. A lot of this has to do with measurement. So if we think about trying to push the open access agenda, what are some other kind of solutions that we can perhaps think towards?
I think there's moments at every level. So it's, what journals do you read? What do you cite? Which journals do you cite from? And demonstrate that they're the ones you read and that are adding value to the conversation. If you're a peer reviewer, who are you reviewing for? If you're an editor, what little poking of the bear can you do from the position that you have? So we have moments where we can intervene in a conversation, tiny moments of resistance or advocacy for the conversation we want to have for our community, which is the research community, not the journal publishing community. So where are those moments in wherever you are in your career? So this isn't like, hey, someone else, a professor over there is going to sort this out. All of us can take a moment and take a stand in whatever it is we're doing when we're engaging in publishing, citing, reading, and sharing articles. So think about those things. I think there's things like that we can do. And the other thing, I loved what you said before, Carly, about establishing your narrative and making the case for your contribution and why you can argue for achievement at this academic level or that academic level. It's about disrupting assumptions. So a lot of this, we're just receiving this environment as though this is how it's always been. It has not always been like this. This is a modern phenomenon. Universities as institutions go back a long, long way before we were having this conversation about pay for publish. Change is always possibility. You know, like change is always possible. Universities are a site of possibility. We can do things here. So I think it's about seeing that you don't have to accept, it's a machine, like be sand in the machine. Stop greasing the wheels by giving the money over, and be sand of critique and questioning and challenging assumptions.
I
Sounds
would
good,
just throw in that that's something that an associate professor actually taught me to do. So in the spirit of kind of mentoring the next generation, because I remember at the time I was thinking, oh, I'm not good enough by these standards. And she really challenged that way of thinking about my scholarly career and my and what I had to contribute. And she, offered a way of writing about that. And upon reflection, that was a really important time when I was applying from level B to C, in just cementing my identity as an academic, and creating, I guess, a vision for myself as to what I wanted moving forward. But it's incredibly uncomfortable, right? Like we all know how hard it is to toot your own horn and go, this is me in the world and this is how I do it, which is why I think these kind of conversations where we model that for each other are really valuable.
I think, Carly, also increasingly within the grant community, that's what we're being asked to do as well, is to justify our benefit, impact, whatever. They're categories now within every grant writing. So actually they're a skill set we need for more than just these things. So all of these things cross over. And again, I think the other thing I would take out of that is I saw some data recently from a society I'm part of, and none of our industry members felt that the journal access was a benefit to them. So they were getting free access through the society, but that wasn't what they wanted. And I think it also comes down to, if it's not in a format that you can actually digest, you're not going to have impact. So again, the work we do, if you were publishing and disseminating, and we measured publication and dissemination collectively, and you had routes for dissemination, that might be another interesting way of looking at some of these things, is publish less, disseminate more. Could be part of what we want to do within open access is, really make it quality, but really think about how you need to get it out there and what we can do to support you to get it out there.
There's also fields where that sort of standard publication for an academic community is the audience that you're after. I work in diabetes, yes, but I work in basic science. We're doing the original base level research that I will make a small increment, then somebody else will use that and add it to their research. And that's how we get to those discoveries at the end. What I'm doing is not of interest to people with the disease. We're not getting towards any sort of treatments or anything. So it is that academic community. And I think, the journals that you read, the journals that you choose to publish in is really important, but it's difficult, increasingly more difficult. We use PubMed and we're doing keyword searches. We're looking for topics when we're looking for articles. We're not looking at the journals. Hopefully we're teaching our students you still need to look at the journal and sort of look at that, but increasingly these predatory journals are getting very, I think there was a study that said something like 60% of academics couldn't identify predatory journals, right? So we're not good at doing it. So probably some, hate to say more education, but more resources to help us identify those journals. Particularly, one of the things that I do is when I'm asked to review, I look into the journal and I make a decision as to whether that journal follows my ethics in publishing. And if it doesn't, I will say to them that it's because of this that I will not review for you and to remove my name. So I can use that small amount of power I have to choose who I'm reviewing for, and I can choose who I publish for. But it is difficult to figure out from the, 80 different journals in the area that you're looking at, because there is that many journals in every single area you want to publish in these days, how to find the right ones, but encouraging people to actually go to the effort to find those right runs rather than, oh, here's one, let's just do it. just I think would be really valuable. So I think Jeanette's point there about looking into them and making those decisions carefully and teaching people that this is, you know, a good thing to do would be really valuable.
Danny, can I say one more thing?
Of course, yes.
I think one of the things we're doing when we rely on these sort of scripts and assumptions and like really proxy indicators of quality is what's happening. So the status of this journal or the impact factor, those things become the thing that you look at instead of really the thing that you're trying to do is publish in the right place to get to the right audience and be joining the conversation you want to be joining. And speaking about slowing down sounds like anti-progress, but it's actually go slow to go fast. So if we are more considered in our decision making around publishing, if we take our time to make good choices here, actually science, research, human knowledge will progress at a faster rate because it's not going to be jumbled up with a whole lot of irrational, non-research related noise, basically, from these things like, you know, predatory publishers and terrible organisations overseas that I won't mention. All of that sort of stuff is muddying up the conversation. The motivation for you know, fraudulent findings and misconduct and, you know, obfuscating articles being published, it goes away if we actually are much more considered and thoughtful about what we're doing. And it is our obligation. We're all signed up to the code. We're supposed to be doing these things. This is what we are saying. Trust in academia, trust in universities is built on us behaving in trustworthy ways and making good academic decisions when they're important, not going along with scripts because it's faster.
There's another side to this that we haven't touched on, which is how you cite. Because there's the other thing is there's often 10 papers that you could cite as a reference for a piece of work that you're doing. And so if you actually stop and think about the citation that you're choosing, rather than putting in 8 citations that all count equally and may have nothing in them that is actually relevant, it's just I've put some numbers in, I've put some citations, so they must be in there. How many people are actually going back and looking at it? You see it in review papers where you know the person hasn't read the paper, but the review list, and suddenly you know yourself, your journal citations go up because it's in that review article. And so I think there's an interplay here with, you know, citations are what drives impact factor. If you're selective about who you cite from, you have another piece of power in all of this, because you will knock a few journals back down to size by not citing their work. And so there's another couple of plays that I think even just right now, we could actually really think about how we utilise our, coming back to Kat's point, the little bit of power we have. Because there's been some vile things done over the years where people have said, oh, well, you need to cite more papers from our journal if you're going to publish with us.
Oh, let's not go down that. Yes, that's a whole other world of pain that we could open up. That's another 2-hour discussion. Let's turn back to the audience, and Caitlin, if you could put up the Mentimeter again, and we'll just get a couple of final thoughts from the audience before we. There we go. So you've heard from at the panel about lots of different things that could happen. So this is an opportunity for the audience to consider what are some of the next steps we can collectively take. So talking about community over commercialisation as a community, what are the community activities that we can take steps to progress open access? Excellent. So that's a suggestion about personal power and what people can do themselves. Because we are all players in this. We're not puppets, we are active players. Linking to repository copies, getting use of repositories up higher. Commit to publishing in Diamond Open Access Journal. And having conversations with students, this is really important. I might even go further than saying, if there's no diamond access journal in your field, not just find out why not, maybe start one. Excellent suggestions here. Sign Dora. Yes, Simon, who's one of the audience members, made a comment at the University of Melbourne have signed Dora. They're one of the few universities in Australia that have to date. We might jump on to the next and final question, which is beyond the community, beyond the collective. This is about you personally. What would you do? What will you do to progress open access? Maybe in the next month, give you 4 weeks till the end of November, just before the Christmas silliness starts. Although there are actually Christmas decorations in the shops already. I do have an objection to Christmas and Halloween decorations being side by side in the shops, but maybe you could wear a badge, that person who'll talk to anyone will listen, which could be talk to me about open access. I think that comment about seeking to cite open access work in submissions that you're writing is really an interesting one, because it then does give the reviewer, if the reviewer is looking at citations, and they're not necessarily always going to, it means they can read them if they're from somewhere that doesn't subscribe. Excellent. I'm going to wrap that because we've only got 2 minutes towards the hour, and I just want to just do a quick summary. Could we put up the call to action slide? So we do have a slide which is a call to action slide. So this is our call to action for those people of the community who are not able to participate synchronously. So this is the asynchronous activity for Deakin and for the community for Open Access Week. So they are our calls to action, for some of which were identified there. I'd just like to summarise some of the little pithy quotes that have come out from what our panellists have said today. To be sand in the machine. So you have the agency to do something. We're not, we are active players here. Publish less, disseminate more. Access is more than open access. Cite well. And we need to go slow to go fast. So they're the summaries of the items that I noted. Are there any last minute comments from our panel? You're all good? Well, thank you. I would really love to say thank you to all of you. We've had such a wonderful conversation today. Thank you, Jeanette, Sally, Catherine, and Carly. Open Access Week, this is our second of 4 in-person activities. We have 2 more. On Thursday, we've got our great copyright debate, What If There Was No Copyright in Scholarly Works, a thought experiment at Burwood at 3 p.m. And on Friday, we've got Beyond Open Educational Resources, Open Educational Practices and Equity for All at Downtown from 3:30 p.m. I'd like to say thank you for everybody for participating. Thank you very much for the panellists. Well done, and have a wonderful Open Access Week.
Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, Danny, and the library.